Hello, my name's John Smeaton, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Family and Life Academy. We're continuing today with our series of webinars, which in one way or another have been focused on the family. One of these was a webinar by a Catholic historian, Professor Roberto de Mattei, who presented an historical overview of attacks against the family from the 15th century, which culminated in the Cultural Revolution of 1968, which Professor de Mattei describes as a revolution against the family conducted in the name of sexual liberation. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse. Dr. Morse will be explaining to us how the early proponents of the sexual revolution theorized that children should be permitted to engage in precocious sexual activity. Her webinar is startlingly entitled Baked In from the Beginning, Paedophilia and the Sexual Revolution. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions which you can put in the chat window at any time during the webinar. Dr. Morse is the founder of the Ruth Institute, an interfaith international coalition to defend the family and to build a civilization of love. Dr. Morse was a campaign spokeswoman for California's winning Proposition 8 campaign, defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. She has authored or co-authored 6 books and spoken around the globe. Her latest book is The Sexual State: How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. Dr. Morse and her husband are parents of an adopted child, a birth child, a goddaughter, and were foster parents for San Diego County to 8 foster children. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you now, any moment, Dr. Jennifer Morse.
Hi, everyone. John, thanks for that kind introduction. Let me begin sharing my screen. There we are. There we are. All right, everyone. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this webinar. And I'm going to do my presentation. And as was mentioned, we will have questions and answers afterwards. Before I begin this presentation, which has a somewhat shocking title, as John mentioned, I want to just say that you're not going to hear me tell you that that all the founders of the sexual revolution were themselves pedophiles. That's not what we're going to talk about. In fact, what I have to say is in its own way even more alarming and even more it's more subtle but more alarming, and that is that the way in which the sexual revolution presented itself and the goals that it aspired to required people to redefine what they meant by childhood and to redefine what duties to parents were, duties from parents to children were, what the duties of society to children are. And so in effect, rather than themselves being pedophiles, what they did is create a set of structures that weaken the protections for children and at the same time, most likely attract people who actually are pedophiles. So my message is going to be a little bit more subtle than you may have thought, but I think it is at the same time all the more disturbing and alarming. So as John mentioned, I'm the founder and president of the Ruth Institute, and we've been in business since 2008, which was when California's Proposition 8 took place, which was when the voters of very liberal California voted in favor of man-woman marriage. And at some point, we realized that we were going to end up losing that battle in the courts, which indeed we did. But in 2015, as you may know, the U.S. Supreme Court redefined marriage from being the union of any man, of a man and a woman, to being the union of any 2 persons. And so leading up to all of that, we realized that we were going to have to broaden our approach to dealing with these questions. And so we've spent a lot of time at the Ruth Institute talking about the victims and survivors of the sexual revolution. And we do have this pamphlet available, which we started developing in 2013. So almost 10 years ago, we started talking about this. And in this pamphlet, we talk about post-abortive women. We talk about refugees from the hookup culture, children of divorce, heartbroken career women, that is, women who postponed their childbearing and fertility years for so long in order to accommodate their careers that they ended up having no children. We had lots of ideas of who the victims of the sexual revolution really were. But if you look at this pamphlet, which you can still get at the Ruth Institute web store if you want to, if you look at this pamphlet, there is nothing there about sex abuse or harassment or childhood sexual abuse, anything like that. None of that is there. And the truth is, I thought about it, but I said to myself, no, I don't want to deal with that because it's not really the fault of the sexual revolution. That's been around forever. Not fair to blame that on the sexual revolution. Well, after a while, I came to the conclusion that that was not exactly correct. That in fact, the sexual revolution had and has a very important part to play in making childhood sexual abuse as common as it actually is. And it was the whole sequence of events that took place around the time that Harvey Weinstein, Theodore McCarrick, Matt Lauer, roughly around 2018, when all of these scandals were coming to light. I finally had to admit to myself that this was related to the sexual revolution, and that the fact that I didn't put it in that original pamphlet, basically, I just didn't want to deal with it. You know, it's a nasty business, and I'm sure all of you know what I'm talking about. You know, no one really wants to talk about it. No one really wants to deal with it. But the fact is that the sexual revolution has created an ideology and has created a whole set of social structures and social ways of thinking that provide cover for predators and that also disarm victims. In other words, we're all supposed to be sex positive. We're not supposed to be anxious or uptight about sex. Everybody's entitled to sex in some way. And so the sexual revolutionary ideology and its structures built around it actually are gravely implicated in the whole sequence of things. Now, when the clergy sex abuse scandal broke again in the year 2018, as you may know, in the US, that was a big year for us. 2002 had been the whole scandal in Boston that Cardinal Law was involved in, the Boston Globe, all of that. That was a big memory for American Catholics. In 2018, the revelations came out about Theodore McCarrick. And at that same time, one of our states, Pennsylvania, issued a grand jury report that was absolutely devastating. It had, hundreds of cases over, 50 years or something like that. Well, at that time in 2018, I had recently hired Father Paul Sullins, who is a sociology professor, who is a retired sociology professor from Catholic University of America. I had originally hired him because of his body of work he'd been doing on the impact of same-sex parenting on children. And I wanted to, he had an ongoing research project. I wanted to make sure that kept going on. And, so we connected with one another and he became part of the Ruth Institute. Well, he said to me in 2018, I was talking to him about what people were saying about the John Jay report and was homosexuality involved in the clergy sex abuse issue in the United States. And he said to me, Dr. Morse, I said, yes, Father Sullins. He said, we could take the Pennsylvania grand jury report, which is a 600-page narrative document. We could turn that into data. I said, what? How does that even work? Well, what he did is he got somebody to go through and code each of the stories, each of the incidents, and code it for the age of the perpetrator and the age of the victim and when the guy, roughly when he was ordained, things, a whole series of things like that. And we could analyze it, we could do some data analysis on that. And so he produced in 2018 a paper that has been variously called the Sullins Report or sometimes the Ruth Institute Report, and answer the question, is Catholic clergy sexual abuse related to homosexual priests? And the answer that he came out with was, yes, absolutely, it's related. And what he did was to correlate the percentage of abuse incidents that that were homosexual in nature, with the percentage of priests who self-identified as homosexual. And this chart, figure 10, shows the correlation. It's a very strong, obviously, over 90% correlation between the percentage of homosexual clergy and the percentage of homosexual abuse in the Catholic Church. So it's a very serious problem for those of us who are Catholics, and I know there are always a lot of Catholics at these kind of meetings. I know it's not exclusively Catholic, but for those of us who are Catholic, this is a very important thing to have in our mind, and we mustn't avert our eyes from it. More recently, I'll just mention, he did in 2019 a study based on more recent data. And in that, he found out that he was following it all the way through 2015. At that time, that was the most recent material that he had. And he said, yes, indeed, there is a decline in clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church, but there is a disturbing increase in it as well that we need to be attending to. And there does seem to be a decline in the percentage of male victims. And the victims seem to be older. More victims are past puberty and not prepubescent boys, as was the case in prior incidents. So I'm telling you all of that for you to be aware that the Ruth Institute has now made a serious commitment to understanding what is going on with sex abuse generally, and with sex abuse in the Catholic Church in particular. And so Father Sullins has done statistical presentations on this matter. The Ruth Institute has interviewed in our video podcast series, which is called the Dr. J Show. We have interviewed any number of people who have in one way or another been impacted by clergy sex abuse, because in addition to the numbers, of course, we also want to have a sense of what is the impact that this is really having on people. We're well aware we can't change church policy, but we feel that if we are able to keep the issue in front of people in a humane way, in a real way, so that it's realistic and not kind of an abstraction, that increases the likelihood that people are going to behave better and insist on better, and so on and so forth. This particular image that I have on the screen here is an interview that I did with a young man whose brother had been molested by their parish priest. And this happened quite recently. This is not an old story. This is something that happened very recently, within the past, I want to say 5 years, 2019, I want to say, something like that. And just to see how it ripples through, how the effects of childhood sexual abuse ripple through the whole family system. By the way, this is a good time for me to mention to all of you that these slides are going to be available to you through John. He's going to make these available to you, the Voice of the Family. And when you go and click on any of these images, it should take you directly to the video that we're referencing, so that you can have access to this material for yourself as we well after this call is over. So we also have a feature called Ask a Survivor. This is our young mother employee, Faith Hakesley, who was sexually assaulted by her parish priest when she was 15 years old. And so she's now writing a column for the Ruth Institute about these type of issues. So I want all of you to be aware that this type of material is available to you. And unlike other people who sometimes talk about these issues, at the Ruth Institute, we are 100% committed to the church's teaching on marriage and family and human sexuality. We're not the kind of people who are going to say the solution to this is to get rid of celibacy, or the solution to this is to lighten up about homosexuality. That's not where we're operating at all, as you'll see as we go along. But anyway, we have a pretty serious footprint in this area, and I think it gives us a kind of credibility that some of the other people out there don't necessarily have. So in previous years, back in 2002, at least in the US, this is how it was. I don't know what it was like in the UK, of course, but when John Paul the Great was Pope, there were a lot of so-called liberal Catholics who were trying to challenge church teaching, trying to get the church to change church teaching. They wanted to blame it all on John Paul. And under the Pope Francis pontificate, that's kind of, you could say, shuffled the deck, ecclesial, the ecclesial political deck, if you want to think of it that way. And so now there are people who previously were all talking about how terrible the Catholic Church is and we have to do something about it. Now that Francis is Pope, those people are very silent, and there are more people who have traditional values who are speaking out, who are willing to speak out about it. And I'm sorry we didn't speak out about it sooner, but my position is better late than never. Let's tell the truth about what we're dealing with here. Okay, so here are the main three topics that I'm going to cover today. First of all, I want to demonstrate to you that that sexual abuse, sexual misconduct, pedophilia is pervasive among the global ruling class. This is not unique to the Catholic Church. And the second point I'm going to make is that the early proponents of the sexual revolution advocated for children to have active sex lives. This was an important point of several of the significant early thinkers of the sexual revolution. And then finally, the third topic I'm going to speak about is that the ideology of the sexual revolutionaries required them to redefine childhood. And that third point is, in a sense, the essence and the most important aspect of this talk. That the way in which they have all along, without telling anybody, been redefining childhood. Okay, and that's something that we're all dealing with today. All right. So pedophilia is currently pervasive among the global ruling class. Now, before I start, I want to speak directly to people, anyone who's watching or listening, either in real time or who may come across this video later. I imagine that there are some of you who have been touched by childhood sexual abuse. And what I want to say to you before we even start is I know that you're there, and I realize that post-traumatic stress disorder is a real thing. And if you are upset, if this is stressing you, if you're being triggered, as they say, feel free to pause. Come back, watch it later. This is being recorded right now, so you'll be able to come back to it. But I understand that this is a real thing and that you may need to care for yourself, okay? We had a speaker at one of our events, Moira Graylin-Pete, who told her life story of being abused by her parents. And by the time she was finished, she was literally crippled. She could not make it out to her car by herself. So I want all of you to know that I know you're there, and that I have an idea of what this might mean to you. Those of you who have not been touched by this directly, we need to say that because of the misuse of the word triggering, people saying I'm triggered when they're really talking about political issues. I'm triggered. I'm so upset. I need a safe space. Okay. When we see people making false allegations of sexual abuse or harassment in order to make political points, this has been a huge problem in the United States. I want to say to everybody that when someone does a thing like that, that is absolutely wrong. Trivializing sexual abuse, trivializing the word trigger by applying these things for political purposes, this is dead wrong, and it needs to stop. Okay, so I'm just going to, with that in mind, I'm going to proceed. All right, so the global ruling class, I think we can say now, they like the sexual revolution exactly the way it is, including pedophilia and sexual harassment. They like the privilege that they have of being able to do what they want sexually. Now, I'm going to give you just a few quick examples here. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a major organization in the United States. It's a very wealthy organization that I would describe as a race baiting organization, and very left-wing, radical left-wing. They're the ones I'm on their list as a hate group, because that's what they do, is they collect people who disagree with them and pin labels on them. Come to find out that the founder of this organization had a whole history of a climate of sexual harassment and abuse within his organization. And this went on for a long time. I'm citing a couple of references here on this point. This went on for a long time, in spite of the fact that everybody knew. It was one of these things everybody knew, but nobody would do anything about it. Southern Poverty Law Center. In the United States, in some public schools, we have this same kind of problem. This book is called Passing the Trash. That's a figure of speech that we use that means moving somebody from one place to the next, okay? This particular book is about a principal and later superintendent who had a history of sexual harassment, and he had groomed, we use the word groomed, he had groomed the whole community to think that he was a wonderful guy, a nice guy. Nobody would stand up to him. This went on for a long time. The United Nations. The United Nations is really quite, in my opinion, quite dreadful. This particular book is one where we've interviewed the author. There have been numerous sex scandals under the auspices of the United Nations. Amongst them are the peacekeeping troops in some of these countries. The soldiers have been basically, what's the right word? Having food for sex or sex for food arrangements with young kids in the camps. So they've got the guys who are in charge of keeping these refugee camps together basically are having sex with kids, and we'll give you food if you have sex with us, kind of thing. This scandal went on in several different countries, and they say they cleaned it up. I don't know that they've cleaned it up, but anyway, they say they've cleaned it up. My point is how widespread this problem is. And then there was this a UN official who wrote a book, who created a document for the United Nations on the rights of children. And among the rights of children are the rights of children to have sex without their parents knowing about it. Then it turned out that and these are some of the documents that he was responsible for creating. It turned out that he was brought up on pedophilia charges himself. Okay, so the United Nations, when they talk about children's rights, they think that means having sex without your parents knowing it. That's what they think children have a right to. The Ruth Institute thinks that children have a right to a relationship with their parents. They have a right to know who their parents are. That's what we mean when we use the term children's rights. But anyhow, this guy was picked up on pedophilia charges, and he had been creating documents basically saying kids have the right to have sex, and the international community must do whatever possible to protect children's rights to have sex. Since I gave this presentation in New Zealand in March, and that's where John saw it and thought that I should come and talk to all of you, in the small period of time that's passed since the end of March, April and May, a couple of recent disturbing events have emerged that are along the very same lines. The United Nations, a commission of jurists, have produced a document which basically says these two incidents I'm going to tell you they're not legalizing pedophilia. What they're doing is softening the ground for legalizing pedophilia. So it's a step towards it. This particular document in Principle 16 is saying that sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed age of consent may be consensual in fact, if not in law. And so what they're trying to say is that laws that we would, in the English tradition, would call statutory rape, that we need to be careful of how we interpret those, because they may be able to make decisions for themselves. Okay, so there it is, international jurists coming out with that thing. That more recently in our, and this is where you can get more information about it, more recently in the United States, in the state of Connecticut, there was a move to redefine what the term sexual orientation means, and to broaden that definition so that it could potentially include any paraphilia, what used to be called paraphilia. And so again, this is a very disturbing trend that we're seeing. And if you say to people, well, this is troubling, this redefinition is troubling, they'll say, well, we're not legalizing pedophilia. What are you talking about? Well, but what they've done is, instead of saying sexual orientation means your preference for heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual, those preferences, now it has something to do with gender and gender identity, which is obviously much broader, much more fluid. And we don't really know what that means, and we won't know what it means until it gets adjudicated, right? And so therefore, for them to say, well, we're not doing anything wrong, leave it alone, you don't have any right to interfere with us changing this definition, making it broader, yada, 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 that's a smokescreen, right? But All of these things are moving in this direction. So here are some links where you can read more thorough analysis of that point. Now, back to the issue of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy. I'm just going to mention this again, because not because we want to say, well, everybody else is as bad as we are. You know, other churches have the same problems, so on and so forth. No, that's not the point of bringing it up. The point of bringing it up is it's our church, it's our problem, those of us who are Catholic. And I just want to put the challenge out there. Do you think anybody else is going to deal with it? When John Paul was Pope, we all felt like we were part of something big, something important, something beautiful. And I think that we can recover that. And I just leave that thought till the end of the talk as to why. I'm bringing up these other groups, not to make excuses for us, but to just point out that, are they going to do anything about it? Or are we going to do something about it? That's the point. I think it's more likely that we are going to have something constructive to offer, much more likely than the United Nations or the public schools in the United States. That's my point. All right, so let's talk now about the early proponents of the sexual revolution and how they advocated for children to have active sex lives. Now, if you want more information about this, I did several interviews on my program. These are hour-long interviews on political philosophy with Dr. Scott Yenner, another hour-long interview with Dr. Carl Trueman. This is a very important book that he did. And in my conversations with the two of them, it became clear to me that there were certain figures that kept emerging in the conversation. And their names are here on the screen: Wilhelm Reich and Alfred Kinsey and Shulamith Firestone, as early proponents of the sexual revolution. And what they have in common is a different idea about childhood. So I want to spell this out just a little bit. None of these three people advocated pedophilia. Okay, I want to make that very clear. None of these three people were themselves pedophiles as far as we know. And yet, their ideas were very destructive and paved the way for what we're dealing with now. That's what I want to explain now. Wilhelm Reich, whose name you may not have heard of, was actually the first person to coin the term the sexual revolution. He wrote a book in the 1930s. He was a little bit of a nut, I would say. He was influenced by Sigmund Freud, rather. And he believed that people could be made more happy by accumulating orgone energy out of the air. And he built something that supposedly did that. And our Food and Drug Administration considered it fraud. And so he went to jail for that, not for some of the other things he did. But anyway, in the course of, let me see what I have here. Okay. But one of the things that he says very clearly in The Sexual Revolution, in his book, he says very clearly that children are sexual beings and children should be allowed to have sex. And we should make it easy for children to have sex. They should have their own apartments. They should have their own money. They should be able to not be interfered with by adults. If their parents are alarmed about it, that parent being alarmed, that's the problem, not the fact that the child's having sex. Most of the time, I think it's safe to say what Reich had in mind was teenagers having sex with each other. I think that's really what he had in mind. But of course, he had no principled reason why they wouldn't be having sex with somebody older than the legal age of consent, because mentally he's made children into sexual beings. Okay. Now, same with Kinsey. Okay. Kinsey was the author of the famous, or you might say infamous, Kinsey reports on sexual behavior in the human male, sexual behavior in the human female. His work in this area basically was trying to say, hey, everybody's doing it. The taboos, I think he's, more than anybody else, I think he made it such that the taboos were the problem. Sexual taboos were making people unhappy. They were unnecessary. We're better off without the taboos. Okay. Now, he had this infamous Table 34 where he supposedly proved that children were sexual beings by gathering data. Now, he did not gather this data himself. A guy reported this data to him, a guy who was a sex offender, because what he's reporting on is the time it would take a child, in his observation, to achieve orgasm. Okay, so just think about that for a minute. And look at the ages of some of these children that he's stimulating somehow, and he's recording them as having an orgasm. Okay, this table is in Kinsey's book. Today, he would be arrested for even reporting it, because he should have reported that guy, right? I mean, that guy is obviously a problem. But what his scientific point was that children are sexual beings. Okay, hold that thought. Shulamith Firestone was an important feminist, a very radical feminist, and her position was that that the goal of feminism should be that sex differences should not be a thing at all. Okay, so she's in a sense way ahead of her time. The sex distinction itself should be eliminated from law and social practice. And so she likewise had the idea that mothers and fathers were kind of irrelevant, because she correctly understood that childbearing is the thing that really makes men and women different. So if you're going to have men and women being 100% equal, you've got to somehow neutralize the impact of childbearing and motherhood. And so she was doing that. She was imagining artificial wombs and all of these things which have now come to pass. She was a schizophrenic, as it says here, and she did die basically alone and in a state of mental illness. Anyhow, what these three thinkers who were very influential, what they have in common are the following. They're all influenced by Sigmund Freud. They believed that sexual repression was a bad thing. They were more worried about sexual repression than about sexual abuse, and that the taboos were harmful to individuals in society. And they all had other objectives besides deconstructing the family. Firestone wanted equality for women. Kinsey wanted free love, and so did Reich. And so if the family fell apart as a result of that was okay with them, right? They had, if the relation between mother and child, between parents and child, if that broke down, that was perfectly okay with them, because they had a big vision, right? And in order for that big vision to take place, the family had to be in some way neutralized. And so what they came up with was that children have to be allowed to have sex without shame or apology. Each for their different reasons, they came up with this idea. So now let's look at the definition or the understanding of childhood, because this is the real nub of the matter in my opinion. Okay. The problem with abolishing taboos is that the taboos are there to protect something. Okay, so when we radical Catholics, advocates for the family, advocates for marriage, when we say, you should really only have sex with the person you're married to, and you should stay married, when we have these things that look like big negatives, the thing they're protecting is the right of the child to be living with their parents for a lifetime. That's what it's really protecting. Mom and dad are already married before Junior is conceived. When Junior arrives, mom and dad are more or less ready. They've made a commitment that allows them to be ready. And if you have in mind that marriage is a permanent institution and you don't go messing around with somebody else's spouse, or somebody's not your spouse, you don't go messing around like that, you're going to stay together. Most likely, it's a better chance that you'll stay together. Better chance Junior's going to have the same mom and dad, his own mom and dad, through his whole childhood. So if that's what you're trying to do, then the taboos, so-called, make sense, because they serve that purpose. But these people that I just mentioned, these pioneers of the sexual revolution, what they wanted was something for adults. They, roughly speaking, wanted to be able to say to adults, you get to do, I'm going to exaggerate here a little bit, but not by much, I think you'll recognize. You get to do whatever you want sexually, and nothing bad will happen. The only bad thing is when people get upset about it, when people judge you, and even kids aren't really that bothered by people having sex with them. It's just their parents getting upset. If you wouldn't get upset, it wouldn't be a problem. Okay, this is the vision that they had. So in order to make that work, you have to have a vision of what it means to be a child. And that's what I want to spell out a little bit here. Now, some years ago, the very first book I wrote was called Love and Economics, and it was really an exploration of motherhood. And this book came about because, as John mentioned in the introduction, my husband and I adopted a little boy from a Romanian orphanage in 1991, and 6 months later, we gave birth to a baby girl. Our little boy came to us after being in a minimal care orphanage for 2.5 years. So his childhood was defined by aloneness in an orphanage. Our daughter was born in the usual way. So we had kind of a ringside seat on what difference it makes whether you have a mom and a dad in your life. So when I wrote Love and Economics, I was trying to explain, wow, this really makes a huge difference. And wow, it really matters. And we need to stop all this stuff of telling adults they get to do whatever they want. Okay. So in this book, and there were 2 editions of this book, okay, which is not all that important, but what I was trying to tell women was that spending your time taking care of a baby was a very, very important pro-social function that you were performing. And don't let anybody tell you that you're wasting your life at home, because you really should be in the office working as an attorney, doing title searches and house closings. That's really more important. You know, that's what I was trying to deal with in that book. And particularly, I was trying to tell people that children, when they're infants, that's when you're bonding with them, you're attaching to them, and you are helping them learn to be social. You're helping them to care about another person. The development of the conscience takes place in that period of time. And I don't mean that children learn the 10 Commandments when they're 18 months old. What I mean is that what mom does between 0 and 18 months lays the groundwork for them to care about the 10 Commandments. Because if they don't care about anybody else but themselves, you see, you can yammer at them all day long about the 10 Commandments. You're never going to get anywhere. So that's what was motivating me when I wrote this book, is this concern that children need to bond with their parents in order to go from infancy to responsible adulthood. And I have since discovered that there are many adults in our world who actually believe that we don't really owe children very much. They don't really need very much. And this is an image of children in one of those minimal care orphanages. My boy is fine, by the way, just for the record. He's a grown-up man now and he's doing fine. But there is a kind of disturbing tendency for a lot of people to dismiss the idea that we have positive obligations, that we brought them into being. If we don't want to take care of them, if we want to choose another parent, we can do pretty much what we want as long as we don't kill them, you know. And so when I was writing Love and Economics in 2001, my chief social concern was for women to feel okay about taking care of their families. And I had several policy concerns at that time. I was very concerned about unmarried motherhood, what we call single parenthood. I don't use that term, single parenthood, because everybody has 2 parents. That's just the reality. Unmarried parenthood, I was very concerned about the impact that has on kids. Divorce, very concerned about that. And finally, the incentive structures that the welfare state in the United States, and I suppose in the UK as well, the perverse incentives that are built into many of the welfare programs are having a tendency to break down the family rather than to build bonds. And then finally, believe it or not, one of the things I was worried about was too much daycare. It almost sounds, I don't know, charming to think that I was worried about too much daycare, but I was. And the problems associated with that really haven't gone away all that much. But anyway, there was not a word about gay marriage or any of that in here in this book. You know, that was not even on my radar. And so we have talked quite a bit at the Ruth Institute about the core truth that children need their parents. And that need for parents means that that places obligations on us as individual adults, and it places obligations on us as a society to have social structures that support the attachment between parents and their children, okay? And so we can now see contrasting views. Our view, what I would say, roughly speaking, is the Christian view of childhood and family versus the sexual revolutionary view of childhood and family. Our concern is that if adults are allowed to have any sex they want without any taboos or restraints at all, children are not going to have permanent access to both of their parents. They're not even going to necessarily know the identity of their parents. And if you think about it, one of the things that has become much more prominent since the advent of gay marriage, it was there before. Can't blame it on gay marriage, but it's certainly become more solidified. And that's the use of what we would call third-party reproduction, or purchased gametes, purchased eggs, purchased sperm, where there's literally no attachment at all between the child and one of their parents. In fact, the state stands between the child and one of their parents, right? And says, you have no right to know your anonymous sperm donor dad. And I know in some European countries there has been some move away from the completely unregulated fertility industry like we have in the United States. In the United States, anybody with money can do anything they want, pretty much. We really can't allow ourselves in modern society to realize how much kids need their parents, see, and how important that is. We've kind of cordoned that off for ourselves and not looked at it too closely. And our favorite thing to say is that kids are resilient. The kids are fine. Doesn't matter what mom and dad do. The kids are fine. Okay. So the sexual revolutionary view is that parents are not the protectors of their children. In fact, kids don't really need protectors. The parents are potential abusers. And there has been a move to redefine what child abuse is, as perhaps you know, that if parents are not sufficiently affirming of their child's new transgender identity, that in some jurisdictions is being considered child abuse. Okay, so the experts of the sexual revolution, the experts of the welfare state, they know the child better than the parents do. And the parents don't really have the child's best interest at heart. The experts and the state, that's who has the best interest of the child in mind. And children need to have sex without shame, apology, or hindrances. That's what's good for children. And so this is a complete redefinition of what it means to be a child and what obligations we have towards children, both as individuals and as a society. So the problem with doing this, I think it should be pretty clear pretty quickly. What's wrong with this is that we're setting kids up for actual pedophiles who really don't have the child's best interest at heart. We're telling everybody you're a sexual being, just use a condom every time, everything will be fine. Children are vulnerable now to being manipulated and seduced. Parents actually do know their kids better than anybody else, as a rule. There are exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, are you really going to bank on the idea that a stranger with a PhD knows your child and their needs better than the actual parents who lived with them? And finally, we shouldn't neglect the fact that as we expect less and less of parents, and the state takes over more and more functions of the parents, the tendency of the parents is to do less and less. And then the state takes over more and more. And then the whole care and upbringing of children becomes less a matter of personal bonds and intimacy and parental child knowledge and a kind of friendship, but a personal thing. It becomes less of a personal thing and more of a mechanical, bureaucratic kind of a thing. And so I think we now know that the kids aren't okay. This is my friend whom I mentioned earlier, Moira Galen-Pete, who had a really terrible experience of child abuse with her own parents. I've now talked to many people who have been survivors of different kinds of childhood sex abuse. I have yet to hear somebody say, the only problem was that grown-ups were upset about it. everybody around me thought it was fine. And so therefore I thought it was fine. I've never heard anybody say that. Now, maybe somebody's out there like that, but, I don't think so. And so what's happening, the children who do survive this, they have all kinds of mental health problems. They feel doubly abused because no one will listen to them when they try to talk about it. And the society is really, we're not really rallying around them in the way that we should be, and taking seriously their complaints. But I find in this and a number of other areas, sometimes people will be alarmed by something like this, and they'll say, well, we need to do this and that, but they'll never go to the core of the sexual revolution. They always want to protect that core idea that adults are allowed to have whatever sex they want, including access to pornography and access to contraception. We're allowed to have all that, but somehow we have to put a stop to these non-consensual things. And so, and the consent, the idea of consent is being asked to carry way more weight than it can actually carry, I think. Okay, so I just want to say to all of our fellow Catholics out there, and to our brothers and sisters of other faiths who may be watching, and I do hope that you are, we are part of something big and beautiful. Trying to reclaim society, build a civilization of love. This is something big and beautiful. And yes, we have problems. There are all kinds of problems out there. And I want to close with this one last little story. When we were foster parents, we had a child. We had a little boy came to our home. He was 12 years old, and he couldn't read. He could barely spell his name, but he passed on and passed on, from one grade to the next. He was in 5th grade, and he was trying to take spelling tests of words he couldn't read. It was crazy. So when we figured out that this is what was going on, I announced to him one day, I said, okay, kiddo, you are so lucky because you are in our house and you are going to learn to read. We are going to take care of this. You're so lucky. We're going to teach you to read. It's going to be great. We're all going to get this done. And he's like, okay, whatever, Well, it turned out that the whole family rallied around, and the whole family did their part. The older kids read to him, wrote a story for him that had grown-up words instead of the little words that you have when you're in 1st grade, that kind of thing. We got tutors for him, and he did it. He learned to read. Now, why, what made that possible? Well, because I knew that he could, and I also knew that we wouldn't give up. Our family was not going to give up until that little boy succeeded. And that's what I want to say to us. That's what I want to say to all of us. All of the corrupt organizations that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, look what we have going for us that none of them have going for them. We have a coherent theory to counteract the sexual revolutionary ideology. We have a coherent, in fact, our theory is coherent and their theory is incoherent. I think we could talk about that if you want to. But we also, within the Christian tradition, we have a whole history of practices and knowledge that would be helpful if we would actually implement these practices. So we have an emphasis on self-command. We have an emphasis on asceticism and being in control of oneself. We have traditions that allow us, that were developed just to protect people from these type of compromising situations. And most of all, we have a group of people who love the church. We love the church enough to do what is necessary to reform it. I don't think the United Nations or the public schools or the political parties or Hollywood, I don't think any of those other groups have anything quite like that. And so it's my considered opinion that if we're going to ever deal with the problem of childhood sexual abuse, it's going to be us who deals with it. It will be people of faith who deal with it. You have a choice. You can take the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a coherent document that has stood the test of time, or you can look at the United Nations rights of the child, which tells kids that they get to have sex without their parents knowing it. That's pretty much the choice that we face right now. In my opinion, we have no right to leave the church over these problems. We have an obligation to defend the deposit of the faith. When I was a little girl, the faith was handed on to me, and it's handed on to you. And we have the obligation to these people who went before us to do everything we can to hand it on in as good a condition as we got it. Thanks very much for your attention. I'll be glad to take questions now.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Morse. I feel sure that your disturbing presentation will actually have encouraged a lot of people, because you articulate so passionately, but so carefully what so many of us have thought, but none of us perhaps have been able to express it as well. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm just scrolling through the chat over here, and there's all sorts of there's a lot of comments over here. So let's talk, John. I don't know how long we have, but I'm happy to talk about whatever's on people's minds.
Okay. Well, here's one from the history books, if you like. One participant has commented that Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, Simone de Beauvoir, and other proponents of the sexual revolution signed an open letter asking the French government to decriminalize sex with minors. Are you able to confirm that? Or
I don't know that. Whoever that is, please send it along to me. Please send me along I mean, I know all those guys are bad guys, right? I'm well familiar with that fact, but I wasn't aware of that. Right. So please send that to me. That'd be swell. I'll work it into the next presentation.
Thank you. So here's another one. Without downplaying the importance of the survivors of the sexual revolution, and obviously you've given examples of that, can any more be said of its victims who don't survive?
Oh, well, it depends on what you mean by survive. Okay, in some way, when we were thinking about how to talk about this, we're trying to draw people in. This, I will tell all of you what we have 50 people on the line. I'll just tell you our little secret. Our idea here was that we needed to do something to enlist more people in this cause, to find ways to engage people that they could relate to, that they could understand, so that it wouldn't just be a handful of us, trying to deal with all the George Soros money and all of his minions that he pays for. So we were trying to do two things. One is to come up with something that, that was accurate, that was true, but also have a way of talking about it that would be appealing enough that people would want to align themselves with it. So we came up with the term survivors, because in the United States, at least, that has a connotation of somebody who has survived against the odds. We don't, in the US, we don't talk about cancer victims or even cancer patients. We talk about cancer survivors. And you have this image of, somebody, against all the odds making it, So that's part of what we were trying to convey by using that kind of language. And it may not have the same connotation over there. Now, as to the people who don't survive, we really need to say something about that, because pro-life advocates are used to talking about the people who have died from abortion. And of course, worldwide, over these decades, we're now in the billions. John probably has an up-to-date number about that, but it's more people that have died in all the wars combined in human history. Isn't that right, John?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in the last 30 years, there's been 2 billion abortions. That's more people killed in the womb than people have been killed from all the wars in recorded human history.
Yeah. So those are the obvious people who didn't survive. That's one set of people who didn't survive. But there are other groups of people who don't survive, who also don't survive. And that I'm thinking now of the number of people who harm themselves all the way to killing themselves from despair that has come about because of family breakdown, relationship breakdown, feeling abandoned, feeling lost. Your spouse wants a divorce. You don't want a divorce. Okay. For men, divorced men have triple the suicide rate of married men. Okay. I mean, divorce triples a man's probability of suicide. So, and then you can look at the fact that children of divorce and children of unmarried parenthood, they have shorter lifespans they have a greater propensity to various kinds of mental illness, including self-harm and things like that. So there are a lot of different people who don't really survive, you could say. So I'm not sure what the questioner was getting at with that, but that certainly needs to be said. And the other thing is that some of the things that we do surrounding the sexual revolution, some of the medical things, just the purely medical things, increase people's probability of death. So you may be aware that there's a link between abortion and breast cancer. You may be aware that there's a link between some kinds of hormonal contraception and early death by stroke and heart attack and things like that. And none of that gets properly accounted for in the whole reckoning of, gee, was this a good idea or not? The people on the other side seem to never look over their shoulder and say, should we really be giving the pill to girls because they have acne? Is that really really, really that's what we should be doing? So.
No, thank you. That was a very helpful answer. Thank you. We've got another question here. How can our society recover their purity of mind and behavior?
Well, I don't think society as a whole can do that exactly right now. I don't think that's the right way to look at the question at this point. At this point, our social structures are so far gone that our first concern has to be to keep ourselves in a strong moral condition. Okay. And we have to remember over the long life of Christian experience that the church has been through a lot of hard times, dark times, been in a lot of places where it looked like we weren't going to survive and so on. So we have to keep that in mind. But the other thing that I would say in response to what you're saying is that right now, the sexual revolution is intrinsically attractive to people. Okay, it is intrinsically seductive. First of all, it's seductive because it has so much cultural tailwinds behind it, right? It has so much momentum that people take it for granted. And so we have that to deal with. But the other thing we have to face up to is that the sexual revolution is telling people you get to do whatever you want sexually and nothing bad will happen to you. And nothing bad will happen to anyone else. And if anything bad does happen, it was probably their fault anyway, So that, when you couple that, that it's a false promise, right? It's one of those false promises that the evil one makes to us. And when you couple that with the fact that the sexual urge is a very powerful urge, right? And now that takes some effort to channel properly. And now somebody's telling you don't have to bother. It's very easy to see why people drift off onto that track. And so what we have to keep in our minds is that you must positively resist the sexual revolution. If you think that you can go off and hide somewhere and you're going to be okay and it's going to be fine, I think the time for that is long, long past. You'll end up being swept away one way or the other. So you have to have it in your mind, all of us of any age. We have to have it in our mind that we have to positively resist. Otherwise, we'll be seduced or swept away.
Well, thank you. I'm going to say that there are more questions coming in. So if you don't mind, we'll just keep going for a little while.
Oh, sure.
Here's one. Before the 1990s, most people who worked in child protection thought that active homosexual men were disproportionately likely to be active paedophiles, and so the consensus was that they should not be allowed to work in pastoral roles with children. Some very questionable psychology experiments, our questioner to you has put, Dr. Morse, some very questionable psychology experiments then reversed the consensus completely. But our questioner suspects that the original consensus was right. Do you think that there is evidence out there to support the older view?
Okay, so the older view has a number of components to it. Okay, one of them is the one that you mentioned, that there's a disproportionate interest by men of homosexual orientation towards younger partners. I think that that's true. I think it's undeniable. The gay lobby will resist admitting that, but within their subculture, you can often see very direct evidence of it. And I don't know how they think they can explain it all away, which is not to say that they're all pedophiles. I'm not going to say that, and you shouldn't say that, because overstating your case is never a good thing to do, okay? But there is a disproportionate interest in younger men. So in the Catholic Church, for example, true pedophilia, that is, the technical definition is sexual interest in a prepubescent partner, somebody who's not gone through puberty yet, okay? The vast majority of cases within the Catholic Church were homosexual men preying on teenage boys. Okay, so teenage boys have passed through puberty, so it's not properly speaking pedophilia, but it is an interest in a younger man, right? And often a vulnerable younger man. That is part of gay subculture, and that is not, that's true. The other thing that's part of the gay experience that's not uncommon, okay, is a disproportionate incidence of childhood sexual abuse that they have experienced. Okay. And so what we have is a whole lot of untreated childhood sexual abuse, or mistreated. That is, it's being, they're misinterpreting what they're seeing, that people become fixated on their first partner, perhaps. They draw a conclusion about themselves. I've heard this story many times. Let me just back up and say this. We have numerous interviews on our channel of ex-gays, and several of the men will tell you, I was a little confused. I was a little unsure as a teenager. And then this older man hit on me, and based on how I responded, I concluded that I must be gay. Okay. And so and if you talk to clergy, our good clergy, they will tell you they hear that in confession regularly. That's not an unusual pattern for people to happen. So now you're telling everybody a homosexual desire is normal, and having sex with somebody a little bit younger than the age of consent is not all that bad, right? So you're setting up some patterns of behavior that then have long-term consequences, and you're not adequately treating the trauma, what may have been a trauma. It's partial trauma, partial enjoyment, which makes it confusing for the child, right? I think most adults can understand what I'm saying here without getting too explicit, and so it's confusing. There's an element that's wrong and an element that's right. And that's all going by without really being addressed in a therapeutic or spiritual manner, right? And so that you got a lot of untreated trauma going around out there. So you asked an important question, but I want you to look at it a little bit more broadly than the way you originally asked the question, whoever that was.
Well, look, we actually have questions pouring in, but I'm terribly sorry.
And you thought, John, we weren't going to have any questions. I always have questions at my talk.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is thank you. One of the responses we've had is an overwhelming number of people thanking you very much indeed for your presentation. I think people will be rewinding and watching this again, which I do remind everybody you can do with Family and Life Academy. Just keep watching this, because if you're anything like me, you need to hear a talk like this a few times. So right. I do apologize to you if your question hasn't been answered, and I'm sure, like me, you've been both delighted and appalled in equal measure to hear what Dr. Morse has shared with us.
Yeah, may I say that I hope John will share these slides with everybody, number one. Number two, that you will come over to the Ruth Institute, sign up for our newsletter, be part of what we're doing, because there's no reason you can't. This is all virtual. We don't have an accent. You'll be able to understand it, everything. And we have now on our website, when you go in to sign up, you will receive right away a free ebook that we've created called Protecting Your Family from the Top 5 Gay Myths. And we also have a special Resist Pride campaign going on, because this is Pride Month in the United States. I don't know if it is in the UK, but it's Pride Month in the US. And so we have a big campaign going on with that. So we would love to have all of you guys be part of that and stay in touch with us. That would be really great.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Morse. You've really robbed me of my closing remarks, but so much more eloquently and convincingly than I could do it, because I think everybody, well, look, I mean, yes, everyone will have the slides, of course, with your commentary through this webinar. They can go back and watch it. And so that's one important, and we'll think of other ways in which we can share your slides. So thank you everyone for joining us today. As we've said, the video of this webinar will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website. And thank you once again, Dr. Morse, for your most illuminating presentation. Thank you.